There's two approaches to giving a talk like this. One is to entertain you for a half an hour. We're dealing at any one time with about 100 academic freedom cases, many of which are very interesting, which I can do without notes and so forth. The other approach, which is the one I'm taking, and I hope you don't object, is to talk, for the first part of the talk, about the concept of academic freedom, because there's a lot of different views of what academic freedom is. So I wanted to do the first part and then talk about the threats and some of the illustrations in the second half, which means the second half is likely to be more interesting for you than the first half, and that'll be the part where Lisa's cutting me off and using her her desire. How did you describe it? You enjoy playing the heavy more than you should. I'd like to begin by answering the question that's the title of this session: does academic freedom serve democracy? The answer is a very simple one: absolutely. Academic freedom is what allows universities to fulfill their unique and indispensable role in a democratic society, to be places, and unfortunately often the only places in our current society, where the public can have a reasonable trust that the search for knowledge and the higher education of students are not corrupted by political, corporate, religious, or other special interests. Academics in the contemporary university are under enormous pressure from a variety of sources that want to shape their teaching and research in the interests of those outside forces, or inside forces sometimes. The struggle to protect the integrity of academic work is never-ending. That struggle is to ensure that the university's integrity is one in which the public has a substantial interest. Academic freedom is at the heart of that struggle. Unfortunately, academic freedom is not a concept that is much discussed amongst the public, or even in the courts or amongst arbitrators. When it is discussed, it's often badly understood, mischaracterized, seen as elitist or archaic. I'd like to begin by talking about what academic freedom is, what it is not, and then talk about its limits. The second half of my talk, as I mentioned, will look at people whose academic freedom has been attacked. My purpose in that part is to illustrate the principal threats to academic freedom. Now, academic freedom is the right of academic staff without restriction by prescribed doctrine to freedom of teaching and discussion, freedom in carrying out research and disseminating and publishing the results thereof, freedom in producing and performing creative works, freedom to engage in service to the institution and the community, freedom to express freely one's own opinion about the institution, its administration, or the system in which one works, freedom from institutional censorship, freedom to acquire, preserve, and provide access to documentary materials in all formats, and, sorry, this isn't working, there we go, sorry, and freedom to participate in professional and representative academic bodies. I'd like to clarify that general definition of academic freedom by talking a little more specifically about 6 things that academic freedom is and is not. First, academic freedom does not require neutrality on the part of the individual. The best scholars care passionately about their work and their quest for understanding and knowledge. They have every right, even an obligation, to share that passion with their students and colleagues, to model a commitment to a relentless search for truth, for knowledge, and to help others learn how to think more expansively, more creatively, and more critically, but not to impose what to think. Academic freedom makes intellectual discourse, critique, and commitment possible. Secondly, academic freedom includes protection of academic staff from the imposition of academic institutional penalties for the exercise of their basic civil liberties. All academic staff, like all other citizens, have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, expression, assembly, and association, and the right to liberty and security of the person and to freedom of movement. Academic staff must not be hindered or impeded in exercising their civil rights as citizens, including their right to contribute to social change through free expression of opinion on matters of public interest. Academic staff must not suffer penalties at the hands of their university or college because of the exercise of their civil liberties. Thirdly, academic freedom requires academic staff to play a major role in the governance of their institution. Academic freedom means that academic staff must play the predominant role in determining curriculum, assessment standards, and other academic matters. These cannot be put in the hands of politicians or governments, boards of governors, or members of the public if academic freedom is to exist. Fourth, academic freedom must not be confused with institutional autonomy, a confusion one finds in U.S. Supreme Court decisions on academic freedom, as well as in much public discussion about academic freedom. And I'll discuss one example of that, of comments John Ibbotson made with regard to Shiraz Dasa last December. Public post-secondary institutions are autonomous to the extent that they can set policies independently of outside influences. That very autonomy can protect academic freedom from a hostile external environment, but it can also facilitate an internal assault on academic freedom. Fifth, we must clearly distinguish academic freedom from freedom of expression. Too often they are treated as synonymous. They are not. Academic freedom is a specific right that is distinct from the general right of freedom of expression. They are not the same, although much discussion within academe treats them as synonymous, as when referring to the academic freedom of undergraduate students, or making statements that everyone should have academic freedom. The former, that is, academic freedom of students, is an affirmation that students should have the right to freedom of expression, well, which then most certainly they should. The latter, saying everybody should have academic freedom, is a worthy desire that all employees should have the right to speak openly without being vulnerable to discipline or dismissal by their employer. Such protection is not academic freedom in the general sense, but is an enhanced view of freedom of expression. As I suggested a few minutes ago, freedom of expression is a component of academic freedom, and then academic freedom protects academic staff from the imposition of academic institutional penalties for the exercise of their civil liberties. Freedom of expression is the foundation for academic freedom. Without freedom of expression and civil liberties, there would be no academic freedom. Finally, academic freedom requires job security. Security that makes it difficult for those offended by the exercise of our academic freedom to retaliate by taking away our academic jobs and suppressing our scholarly work. That is why tenure is vital. Tenure is not a job for life, but rather is a result of a grueling process requiring arguably the longest probation of any profession in the world, after which one can only be discharged for just cause and through a rigorous and fair process. Now, if academic freedom is a special right important for academic staff to be able to fulfill their vocational, institutional, and public responsibilities, we need to be clear that it is a professional right. By that I mean, I think there is no realistic alternative but to seeing academic freedom grounded in the profession. That is, a right that is part of the academic profession, that applies to those within the profession, however broadly or narrowly we define profession, and we can talk about that in the question period if you'd like, and whose limits are primarily determined by the profession. But baldly, we are entitled to academic freedom because for us as academics, the right is a necessity to do our jobs properly. The principal limits to academic freedom are those set by professionals in the broadest sense. While it may be argued that the limits to academic freedom are set by the law or courts, that is true only insofar that there is professional acceptance of those limits. Perhaps it's more precise to say that the limits of academic freedom are influenced by the law, but not determined by it. Sometimes we academics, in a collective sense, and our academic organizations, defend illegal behavior on the grounds of academic freedom. Most often we do not. For example, there are instances when courts or what courts or human rights commissions might define as conspiracy, civil disobedience, sedition, treason, defamation, or hate speech that would be seen as a legitimate exercise of academic freedom. Consider, for example, the situation of Chandler Davis. Chandler Davis was an American mathematician who was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and was asked to testify. He chose to say that he had a First Amendment right not to do so. As a result of that position, he was convicted. He was the only academic in the United States during the McCarthy period that was jailed in Leavenworth Penitentiary for claiming his right under the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment provision to refuse to answer the questions of the committee. He subsequently, after getting out of jail, came to Canada, to the University of Toronto, where he became one of Canada's preeminent mathematicians. Or consider German academics incarcerated or killed by the Nazis, or South African academics convicted for disregarding apartheid laws, or Russian academics who were exiled or killed for rejecting Stalin's imposition of Lysenkoism on Russian biology, or academics in the United States who've been arrested for violating new anti-terror laws since 9/11. The boundary line between, what I'm trying to say is the boundary line between the legitimate exercise of academic freedom and an illegitimate claim is contested terrain. That boundary line is ever-changing, it's expanding or shrinking, and it emerges from professional debate and discussion. CAUT's aggressive defense of academic freedom cases has helped redefine what academic freedom is in Canada. For example, one instance, the first major academic freedom case that CAUT had was in 1957, when Harry Crow, who was a professor of political science at United College, which is now the University of Winnipeg, but at that time was a church-related college, was on a sabbatical leave at Queen's University. And he wrote a letter to one of his colleagues saying that he found it offensive that the president of United College was trying to get faculty to raise money for the church that sponsored their institution. And he also added that he thought it would be disastrous if the Tories won the upcoming federal election. That letter got into the hands of the president of the university, who fired Crow. That kind of thing would not happen today. There's been a fundamental change as a result of battles over academic freedom, so we have a more expansive notion of academic freedom than we did at that time. Although the scope of academic freedom is broadened appreciably, there are clearly some things that are not protected by academic freedom. Sorry, let me go back a second here. For example, one does not have the academic freedom to misrepresent research findings. One doesn't have the academic freedom to plagiarize the work of others. One does not have the academic freedom to sexually or racially harass students or colleagues. One doesn't have academic freedom to insist that a journal editor must publish your article even though it's been rejected by the peer reviewers. One way to understand the professional context of determining academic freedom is that professional judgment protects academics against what, in a very interesting article, Glenn Morrow referred to as incompetent outside authorities. What he meant by that was people of goodwill or ill will who want to have their ideological, administrative, political, religious, commercial, or personal views supersede professional standards in academic decision-making. I will illustrate this with cases in the second half of my talk. Having said that, it's important to acknowledge that the professional context of academic freedom itself has its own challenges, as professional standards are themselves contested terrain, subject to revision and modification as a result of debate and discussion inside and outside the profession. The necessarily provisional nature of the notion of profession and of professional standards, which are explicit and tacit normative standards, has caused many to seek another basis for academic freedom, often ending in a vague libertarian position that makes academic freedom indistinguishable from freedom of expression for those within the profession. That road leaves us defenseless when faced with, for example, the professor of biology whose personal epiphany causes him to make creationism a centerpiece of his first-year biology course. While the creationist, like the flat earther, is clearly outside the boundary of academic freedom, since they have no professional basis for their position, we face other instances that, to many, seem not so clear-cut. By talking about cases, however, that seem to be at the limits of academic freedom, it diverts us from the principal issue, which are the threats to academic freedom. The principal threat to academic freedom is not excessive or inappropriate use, but rather its attempts at suppression or passive self-censoring. It's suppression by forces that do not want opposing or critical views heard, or passively as a result of we academics self-censoring ourselves so we do not offend those in power, either within the academy or outside. Effective education and serious attempts to advance knowledge necessarily involve questioning authority, examining taken for granted perspectives, encouraging a critical and reflective attitude toward one's world, and looking at life in new and challenging ways. This is almost always threatening to those in power. The history of intellectual progress, I would suggest, is a history of resistance to the silencing of unwelcome or challenging views. That silencing has had a long and sorry history. I mean, think of Socrates in the aftermath of Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian Wars, who was put to death for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Or Galileo, persecuted for his heretical heliocentric views, who was forced to recant after the threat of torture and spent the last 9 years of his life until 1642 under house arrest. Perhaps the most notable part of that story, it wasn't until 1983 that the Roman Catholic Church finally acknowledged that Galileo might be right. Or Bertrand Russell, arguably one of the greatest British philosophers, logicians, and essayists of the 20th century, who was fired from his post at Cambridge University for opposing British involvement in World War I. Or more recently, for any of you who have seen George Clooney's Good Night and Good Luck, you'll know a bit about the McCarthy period in the United States when hundreds of American academics were fired, many thousands were silenced. I mentioned one, Chandler Davis, earlier. And parenthetically, while less bad, we Canadians cannot see that as a moment of pride because behavior in this country did not live up to what it should have. That past is still with us and is the principal threat to universities fulfilling their public responsibilities in the search for knowledge and education of our students. Let's look at the principal threats to academic freedom and start with politically motivated risks. The first example I have is from the Western Standard. In a feature issue last year, it highlighted Canada's 12 most radical professors. Conspiracy kooks and commies, US bashers and bigots, meet the 12 radical profs. You won't believe what they are teaching. And then they had profiles of each of them. I'll just show you one. Sunera Tabani. In case you can't see it, assistant professor, Center for Women's and Gender Studies, University of British Columbia. Tabani was amongst the first outside of Gaza to revel in the murder of thousands of Americans at the hands of al-Qaeda's killers on September 11th. Scant weeks afterwards, she told an Ottawa feminist conference that Americans were the real terrorists. The U.S., she said, was the most dangerous and powerful global force unleashing horrific levels of violence. U.S. foreign policy is soaked in blood. Even BC's premier condemned her speech as hateful. Still, universities are buying what this firebrand feminist is selling. The former president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women is a rising star, having been appointed the Ruth Wynne Woodward Endowed Professor in Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University in 1996 before she even finished her doctoral dissertation. She gained her current post in 2000. Though Tabani hails from Tanzania, where Sharia law is still practiced, she said that we're the real misogynists, stating, "There will be no emancipation for women anywhere on this planet until the Western domination of the planet is ended," unquote. Now, this pattern of attack is a time-worn method that's aptly described by Jonathan Cole, who was provost and dean of the faculties at Columbia University from 1989 to 2003, in the following way. Attacks on academics follow a clear pattern, Cole said. A professor is singled out for criticism. This is followed by media coverage that carries the allegations to a larger audience. The coverage is often cursory and sometimes distorted. Some citizens conclude that the university harbors extremists who subvert our national ideals. Pressed by irate constituents, political leaders and alumni demand the university sanction or fire the professor. Now, this is exactly what happened to Tabani, one of the principal donors to the University of British Columbia, the owner of Imperial Parking in Vancouver, which is, I'm told, the 4th largest parking company in North America, said he was cutting off all his donations to the university until Tabani was fired, and he was going to organize all their major donors to do the same. Now, to the credit of the University of British Columbia, the vice president academic stood up and said, whether I agree with Tabani or not, she has the academic freedom and we're not going to bow to that kind of threat. Another example of sort of a politically motivated threat to academic freedom was one that was known to many of you, and that involved Professor Shiraz Dasa. Oh, I'm sorry, by the way, Western Standard, in case your favorite professor was not one of the 12, had this little ad in their paper welcoming you to nominate others who merited similar treatment. Sadly, for any of you who wish to do that, Western Standard announced recently that it was going out of business, so you've lost your chance. Shiraz Dasa is a political scientist who's taught at Saint Francis Xavier University since 1988. When the Globe and Mail reported that he had presented an academic paper at a conference in December 2006, at which there were a large number of academic participants, but also a few very well-known neo-Nazi Holocaust deniers, there was outrage expressed against Professor Dasa. John Ibbotson, the Globe and Mail columnist at the time, devoted a whole column to Dasa and to academic freedom. And he said, "The ancient principle of academic freedom was designed to protect the university from persecution by the state. If you were invited to a conference because of the position you held in a corporation or an organization, and you embarrassed that corporation or organization by your presence or your acts, then the corporation or organization would have the right to discipline you. If Saint Francis Xavier University surrenders that right, it surrenders any right to defend its own name." Mr. Ibbotson, in my view, is wrong on all counts. Academic freedom was not, as Ibbotson claims, designed to protect the university from persecution by the state. Academic freedom is to protect the right of academic staff to speak the truth as they see it without repression from their institution, the state, religious authorities, special interest groups, or anyone else. Universities can only serve that public interest through the advancement of knowledge if they are places open to the widest diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. Places where criticism and debate, not silencing and suppression, are the responses to perspectives with which one disagrees. Universities are a community of scholars that depend on vigorous and open debate to advance knowledge and understanding. Getting rid of those academics who have inconvenient views may appeal to Mr. Ibbotson, but the price is the destruction of the foundation of our universities and ultimately the weakening of democratic society. Another source of external threats are pressure from state or political authorities. I have lots. How much time do I have left? About 7 minutes. So I'll just do a couple of these quickly. One of the most dramatic examples that we've been spending a lot of time on recently involves the First Nations University of Canada. Now, whereas St. Mary's or Dalhousie are created by acts of the government of Nova Scotia, the First Nations University of Canada was created by an act of the Saskatchewan Federation of Indian Nations. So it is the governing not the governing body, the government vis-a-vis that institution. The vice chief of the FSIN, who's responsible for education, is also the chair of the board. He walked into the university one day, advised 3 of the senior administration that they were gone, told all of the staff in those administrators' offices and all the finance staff that they were suspended without pay for indefinitely, and launched a reign of what I would call terror that lasted for a good deal of time. He seized the university records, took the central hard drive on which all faculty and student records were kept, and had a copy, multiple copies. And as a result of his actions, the president of the university left, the vice president academic left, the deans of the two campuses were fired. About a third of the academic staff, mostly First Nations, has left the university. Close to half of all the non-academic staff have left the university. The enrollment is down markedly. And this was all part of an intervention by the equivalent of a state authority in that case, who had disagreements with the leadership of the university. There are numerous other examples. Another source of threat are social interest groups. The example I'd give you here is Michael Cito. Michael Cito is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He's doing research on pedophilia. And one of the things that work in pedophilia has identified is that there are, amongst pedophiles, there are those who have pedophilic inclinations but don't ever act on it. And there's others who do act on it. And Cito's research, funded by the Ontario Mental Health Foundation, is to try to understand what is the difference between those people with pedophilic inclinations who don't act on it and those who do. Well, a social interest group, something called the Canadian Justice Foundation, which is based in Calgary, took umbrage that the Ontario Mental Health Foundation was funding such research. Sean Howard, speaking on behalf of the foundation, said, "I find it absolutely bizarre that we're even considering funding this. We already know what sex offenders and pedophiles are capable of." And so pressure was put on the Ontario government to cut the funding. The social interest group intervention can quickly morph into state intervention. In the CEDO's case, the Ontario Minister of Health quickly leapt into the fray, saying that the province will claw back from the Ontario Mental Health Foundation any money it gives to fund this research. Now, CAT looked into this thing. The research, CEDO's a serious academic doing important work, recognized in the field. His research had passed muster by the ethical standards at universities both at Toronto and in Alberta. And as a result of our intervention, the Ontario government backed off and his research has been able to continue. Now, a third or fourth source are corporate interests. The poster person for this is Nancy Oliveri, and many of you will know the story. I'll try to tell it briefly, given Nancy is one of the preeminent researchers in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's a hematologist. Her research is in disorders of the blood. One of the most prevalent disorders of the blood in the world is a disease called thalassemia. It affects people when they're very young. They usually die in early adulthood. And the only treatment for thalassemia causes a buildup of iron in the blood such that everyone who has the disease has to be hooked up to something to take the iron out of their blood for 8 to 10 hours a day, 4 days a week. So it has a massive and devastating effect on the quality of people's lives. Nancy had seen some science that looked like it could be the basis for developing a drug that would treat thalassemia without causing a buildup of iron in the blood, and so did the research to develop it, got it to a stage where it had to go into a clinical stage and had to have a drug company as a partner in that. Apotex, the largest generic drug manufacturer in Canada, which was quite interested in becoming a brand name drug manufacturer because that's where the real money is, agreed to be her partner in that work and funded and made possible her ongoing research. Over a period of time, she discovered that this drug, in which she had great hopes, appeared to lose its efficacy. As well, she discovered subsequently that for some patients it caused scarring of the liver, which could be fatal. She immediately reported to Apotex, and they threatened to sue her if she published her findings. She went to the University of Toronto and the Hospital for Sick Children, and neither provided appropriate support for her. In fact, subsequently, the Hospital for Sick Children tried to fire her, and then later took her to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, making a variety of bogus claims. She was under attack, and this was a battle CAT and the University of Toronto Faculty Association fought for 7 years. The result of it was a full vindication of Oliveri. The College of Physicians and Surgeons found her work was exemplary. She's become known nationally and internationally. If any of you have read John le Carré's book or seen the movie The Constant Gardener, he was inspired to write that by his getting to know the Oliveri case. In fact, has helped us with a lot of fundraising for Oliveri. But her life was made a holy hell for a period of 7 years because she simply wanted to pursue her research, and there were powerful corporate interests that didn't want that to happen. Now, as we talk about the threats, there are also internal threats to academic freedom. One is the concern for financial interests. The poster person, well, there's two I'm just going to do quickly, if I may. One is Professor Steph McLaughlin at the University of Manitoba. Steph is a professor of environmental studies. He was doing research into the farmers' reactions to genetically modified crops. Part of his SSHRC fund, Social Science and Humanity Council, Research Council funding, gave him money to develop a video to sort of summarize his findings so he could share them with the farmers who had been the subject. So he published the first part of his work in academic journals, but he also developed a video that he was going to share with the farmers. And this was during the period, if any of you remember, when genetic modification of crops was a big issue. Percy Schmeiser case was before the courts. He developed this video. The University of Manitoba pulled out a policy from the 1960s, that nobody knew existed that pointed out that while faculty are free to write whatever they want, and it's their intellectual property, anything in a recording format had to be shared with the university, and they had to negotiate with him the release of his video. This negotiation took 3 years. In the final stages of it, the person who was negotiating for the university, they just effectively blocked the release of the video at a time when there was a lot of national interest in this, so there was some indication this would get some play. Then the person who was doing the negotiation for the university seemed to disappear, and about a month later was announced as the new president of the University of Manitoba Smart Park. Now, what the University of Manitoba Smart Park is a block of land adjacent to the university where they were encouraging corporations to locate so there could be synergy with the university. And this guy who'd been their chief negotiator reappeared as the president of the Smart Park to announce the first tenant of the Smart Park, Monsanto. McLaughlin came to CAUT. We negotiated with the National Farmers Union, had the world premiere of his video at the National Farmers Union Convention in defiance of the university, and then took it on tour across the country, ending in Winnipeg, where we rented the Winnipeg Art Gallery, had 600 people turn out to see the video, and the Organic Farmers Association of Canada brought organic popcorn for everybody at the event. Well, there's loads of other examples. I'm out of time, am I not? David Healy, who had been sought by the University of Toronto, one of the world's authorities in antidepressants, a professor in England. They'd been trying to recruit him for 3-4 years. He finally agreed. He came. They invited him before he took up his position to give a talk at an international conference that they were hosting. In that talk, he talked about the inappropriate influence of the pharmaceutical industry and medical research, illustrated the problem in his own field by saying, well, the SSRIs, the family of antidepressants like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, there's been anecdotal evidence for a decade that for some people who take those, they actually develop more suicidal ideation. And for others, it's wonderful. But the industry had effectively prevented any research to identify the profile of people who had gotten worse as a result of it. The implications, he said, are clear. As a result of that, the University of Toronto sent him a letter 3 days later advising him that his position was taken away from him because of what he had said in the speech. Now, we fought that out. We won it. We won a settlement. By that point, he didn't want to go to the University of Toronto, so they had to make him a visiting professor for 5 years. They bring him over from the UK to give lectures. They pay the difference in his salary between what he had earned at U of T and there. And we had a big event at the Bloor Cinema where 500 people came out to hear his talk, which was titled "The Talk That Cost Me My Job." In the question period, I'd like to talk about, if there's time, a local case, which may be, well, there's 2 local cases that are probably the most egregious violations of academic freedom of which I'm aware. One involving Dr. Gabrielle Horn at Dalhousie and Capital District Health Authority, the other involving Michael Goodyear, who's here with us tonight. And then finally, I'd conclude by saying the biggest threat, however, to academic freedom is none of the above. It's what's called casualization. Universities are replacing tenured full professors when they retire with part-time faculty who have no security whatsoever. They're on 1-year contracts, and if someone doesn't like what they say, you don't have to fire them, you don't have to do anything, you simply don't renew their contracts. Well, we have no reliable information in Canada about the percentage of faculty that are on part-time contracts. We do in the United States, where 68% of faculty at degree-granting institutions are off the tenure track. In Canada, we have anecdotal information. We know at Carleton, more than 50% of the courses are taught by non-tenured track faculty. There will be no academic freedom if this trend continues and people are made vulnerable. So, the job of protecting academic freedom is a job that falls to academics, but it's also a job that falls to the public, which is why we're grateful for opportunities to talk with you about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me tonight. I'm really not a specialist, as Jim is, or as some people in this room are. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an academic. I'm just a writer. But the wonderful thing about this country is the fact that I get to write pretty much whatever comes into my head, and the pay isn't bad. But I do get a chance from time to time to wax on about certain things that just seem bizarre, stupid, or illogical. Mainly it's about politics, because that's a great place for those types of things to live. But also occasionally from the academy. To my mind, academic freedom should be fairly simple. It should be the freedom to teach, the freedom to learn. I have 2 university-age kids. I hope they're free to learn, and I hope they're learning in a great environment. I happen to think they are. But I have written occasionally about academics wrapping themselves in the flag of academic freedom and claiming immunity from criticism or contempt. Yet it is in these contemptuous words and actions that I find objection to the behavior of certain academics. This is not a theoretical thing to me. It's what people say and what people do. This series is about freedom, freedom of expression. It's something I cherish. And my world is built around it. I've been in this business since I was a boy, literally. And news is built into my gene structure, I guess. But freedom of expression is so vital to what I do that journalism would have to fold up its seedy little tent and move away if there were any restrictions placed on it. Freedom to write and to express views, whether in the academy or in the media, is basic to democracy. I was reminded of that last week. I spoke to a conference of Crown prosecutors from across Nova Scotia. There was about 100 people in the room, and I would guess no more than half of them actually supported or saw any merit in the news media's right to free speech and free reporting. It interferes with their cases. It complicates things when we ask questions and then print the answers, and Crowns don't like that. They don't understand why we just don't wait till the whole process is over with and then simply write down what they and the learned judges have had to say, and verbatim, if possible, so we can't shade the profundity of their arguments in ways that our audiences might actually find interesting or compelling. They don't understand why we go to court to keep our reporters out of court. One of our reporters has been summoned in a trial in Colchester County, and this Crown was there, and he was saying, how dare you, dispute my calling your reporter to come and testify? And my response was, how dare you dispute my right to have that right? I mean, it's in the Constitution. We have a clearly stated right in the Canadian Constitution and in the Charter to free expression, yet, at the same time, it still exists. There are publication bans. They're very frequent. Sealed orders. And in the post-9/11 world, even secret trials and secret court processes. I actually, though, believe, after all these years that I've been at this, and I believe this in my heart, that my fight and the fight of my employers for many years for the right to unrestricted free speech coincides and correlates very well with the fight of the citizen. In many cases, we take that fight up for the citizen. So anyway, that's my rant about the journalistic part. Let's talk about the academic right. I believe academics have every right of citizenship to free expression, every single right. I believe they have every right to express unpopular views. They have the right to protect their views from infringement and theft. They have the right to be wrong. And I fully support those rights, and I also demand that academics respect mine. What I don't buy into is some kind of special, delicious, golden, shiny, and unapproachable academic freedom that the rest of we proles don't share. I don't recognize some special academic right to be wrong that exceeds the right to be wrong of citizens like me. I do not consider academic freedom to be a shield against criticism or condemnation. There is no special uber freedom written into the Charter of Rights that says professors are absolved from any interest in the welfare of the institution they claim to represent. There is no runic imprint in the Constitution which says that someone with a PhD in a university can say something that a PhD working in private business can't. It may actually work out that way, but that's not the law as I understand it, and I am a lay person. I don't believe that scholars should be able to treat their employers with contemptuous impunity, and that's where I think the Shiraz-Daza case comes in. I'm not talking about Sean Raleigh or Colin Dodds. I mean, universities are run on the money of the public and the students, tuition and public funding, for the most part. Now, this, of course, gets us into the gray area that Jim mentioned about, influence of government and influence of institutions, and that's why CAUT and others should be in there fighting, spending their members' money, defending those rights, and making sure everyone understands where the limits are and what they actually mean. And without those definitions, it's so vague as to be just a list of things that people can do simply because their employer is a university. That's the part I get nervous about. Universities live up to the test of citizenship, and I applaud them for that. A vital part of our society and a vital part of our democracy. But they also provide sometimes a forum for the purely egotistical and the crank, the Philippe Rushtons of the world and whatnot. And I think he's still at Western, if I'm not mistaken. There's something else going on in universities that's as much of a threat to academic freedom as anything else, and that is political correctness. I think it sort of grew up in universities. I know there were outside influences of it as well, but it is sprung up with all kinds of novel definitions of the word harassment. And I noticed the only one that Jim mentioned, which was sort of verboten, is sexual harassment, but there must be lots of other kinds that should also be watched. Political correctness, I know from my experiences with it in the media, it is corrosive in the extreme. It is a form of intellectual totalitarianism, and it has to be opposed, and its creeping influence is there in the academy as well, and professors and others should be out there fighting it. But it is more than a bit ironic that it is almost a creature of the academy that it is plaguing today. It grew like a virus, and it's out into the media now, the government, and the broader society. Just to wrap this up, Jim has spoken about the incorruptibility of knowledge in the university setting. A fair goal, if it exists. I mean that academic thinking might not be as tainted by corporate, political, religious, or other special groups, but is hardly as pure as we'd like it to be. It is not pure. That is a fallacy. I mean, CAUT, in fact, is a very elaborate and classy, but still, in many ways, a labor union. And that, by definition, is a type of influence that anybody, any economist could understand. I do support academic freedom. I support the right to think, research, speak. I hope that free thought does flourish in the university setting and that our great universities continue to be important structural members in the House of Democracy. However, I still see it as a civil rights thing, as a charter issue, as an issue of citizenship, and as an issue of equality. I don't see tenure as necessarily the answer to a lot of problems. I mean, it may be the longest probation in the world, but it might be for the best job in the world. So, you know, there are balances in these things that are already fairly well built into the system. I worry about self-policing. I actually worry about that in the media, too. You know, I worry about it in laws among the stockbrokers, the medical societies and all this, the self-regulating organizations, which are very prevalent in our society, and I think they're also probably very strong in the academy as well. I think the stresses and strains that are working on academics and their freedom are normal in a democracy. These are the tests that we're always pushing and pulling at. It could be anything in our society from the Quebec's role, you know, how the economy should evolve, and the other constitutional and civil tests that grow up. And I think this is just one of many, and one that requires some investigation and some thought, but not one that by definition of an academic freedom somehow supersedes all others that are foreseen under our charter.
First of all, I basically agree with the definition that Jim articulated for academic freedom, with a couple of additions, perhaps. And until Dan added a fair number of these, I was going to say that there wasn't much focus on the limitations. And anything is defined by defining it and telling you where it stops. And I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the limitations, not because I'm in any way opposed to academic freedom. I'm in favor of it. But I think the real question is, where are the limits? And one of them that Jim alluded to already was that it needs to be a professional right. Whether Dan likes it or not, it is a kind of special right or professional right, rightly or wrongly. And I think very often it's stated too largely because it's not necessarily linked to the academic role, however one defines that. So that's one limitation. Another, and I thought I would just quote the section from the Dell definition, or Dalhousie definition, there's lots of them, about limits on academic freedom. The statement goes, the parties agree that academic freedom carries with it a corresponding responsibility on the part of members to use their freedom responsibly, with due concern for the rights of others, for the duties appropriate to the member's university appointment, and for the welfare of society. Academic freedom does not confer legal immunity. Now, there's lots of other very positive things as well, and that's negative. But, and again, I don't suspect Jim would disagree with that, but I think it is important to state that there's a duty of responsibility that goes with that speech. The second question is, that's what it is at the broad sense. Who has academic freedom? And I was interested to hear Jim say really it is professional professors and librarians or staff, not students. There are writers who suggest students do have academic freedom, and that's an interesting debate. It may, in fact, be more some sort of variant of free expression generally, but there is an argument that universities as an institution should have academic freedom, and the role of professors, students is an important one that I'll come back to, but that, I think that's an important point. Visiting speakers, you know, when Netanyahu came to Concordia and wasn't allowed to speak, that was a kind of academic freedom question as well. So I'm not sure I completely agree with Jim that it's strictly a staff kind of thing. And it is special rights along with tenure and sabbaticals and other things that people not in the academic world hate us for, right? special treatment. That's a bit of an overstatement, but an interesting contrast occurred to me in terms of the employer point in the Ibbotson piece, for example. How much does it matter that your employer is a university? One of the areas I work in as well is education law or school law in the public school setting, and there it's a very different scene. And in fact, there was an early quote, I won't quote in light of time, but from an American case basically saying academic freedom doesn't apply in the public school for two reasons. A rather offensive comment that both the students and the teachers lack intellectual maturity, so it doesn't apply for those reasons, and I don't subscribe to that. I'm just quoting an American judge who said that. More recent views have a different view on that, but in the more recent views, they clearly indicate that a teacher in a public school couldn't freely criticize their employer, or at least not the same way that you could in a university, without expecting repercussions. And perhaps most importantly, and this goes to the no doctrine kind of view, that a teacher in a public school, so pre-university, has a prescribed curriculum. I mean, again, it's like defining the role of the academic, defining the role of the school, but the role of the school is seen as transmitting information unless there's sort of free form and debate among volunteer attendees. It's people who have to be there. Now, all those lines, I think, are breaking down a bit, but I just raised that as an interesting counterpoint, and I suppose as part of that counterpoint, I just throw this out, the Ross kind of case, that there may be a role model situation, the Malcolm Ross case where he was not allowed to teach anymore because he made anti-Semitic statements. You know, how would that apply to the university, or is it perhaps ridiculous to suggest that university professors are role models? Maybe we haven't sunk that low, right? But in any event, that's certainly not the case in schools. You're expected to be. One other interesting little just side point, I know time is short, in the schools is a case out of BC called the Cromer case, where they raised the question of whether you could change your hat when you're outside the school setting. This, again, schools, not universities, but it was a teacher criticizing another teacher at a parent-teacher meeting, and there the comment of the case, the courts, was that you're always a teacher. And I presume that would apply in a university context, although it is an interesting question to debate. You know, can you say, well, I'm not speaking as a law professor, I'm speaking as Wayne McKay, citizen, or I'm speaking as Wayne McKay, former human rights, whatever. Can you change your status, and does that affect it? So I don't really have an answer to that in the university setting. The answer in the school setting is that you can't, that you're always representing the institution. The legal basis, as I think suggested by Jim, for academic freedom is at least partly the collective agreement, largely the collective agreement, because the problem in Dan's analysis about just basic charter rights is the charter doesn't necessarily apply to universities. So in fact, if you didn't have it in the collective agreement, that's another interesting question. Where do you get it? Is it just implied in the job if it wasn't in the collective agreement? And that raises some other interesting questions about the who. In addition to students, do students have it? What about academic administrators? Jim and I almost got to explore that one when I was at Mount A, not personally, but on a study that we're doing. But that's an interesting question. What can a vice president academic or a president or a dean say and have their academic freedom, or do they have academic freedom? Again, I think that's not so clear. In terms of students, if they have academic freedom, where is it? Is it in the calendar? All those kind of interesting questions. Let me come to the questions of limits, because time's marching on. I think there clearly are legal limits, and I guess that's one point where I might disagree a little bit with what Jim was saying as well. While the profession gets to define it to some extent, ultimately the law prevails in terms of defining that. And for example, hate speech in the Criminal Code 319, clearly a limit. Defamation and libel, a little trickier one. There was actually an arbitration by former Dean Innes Christie, the Kane case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, that was on academic freedom limited in respect to defamation and libel. Human rights codes, Cases like the Ross case or others, although it would be in a university context, would be another. Interesting article that I read preparing for this saying that academic freedom does not extend to civil disobedience, that academic freedom doesn't give you the right to disobey the law even for a good cause, although you can talk about civil disobedience, not necessarily advocate it or practice it and be protected by academic freedom, but talking about it in class would be okay, another thing to debate. More informal limits, and I'll just list them very quickly for purposes of discussion. One, Jim already alluded to, vices and wrongdoing. Academic freedom doesn't allow you to be drunk in class. At least I don't think it does. Beyond the academic role, it does have to be professionally connected to what you're doing as an academic. It's not a general license to say whatever you like. It has to be connected to the inquiry, the teaching, something of that kind. It should not, and this is a bit more contested territory, it should not be imposing your views on students or others who might not be as powerful as you are. An interesting question about the sort of power context. The responsible use I've already referred to, and perhaps even more important, the fact that it has to be part of the scholarly method. So let's take Rushton. There would be a debate about that, but some would say part of the problem with that, rightly or wrongly, was that it was not a scholarly conclusion. Not that he couldn't say it, but if you're going to say controversial things, do your homework and do it in a way that is defensible. And as some say, it's not a shelter for demagogues and so on. Student focus, just very quickly, I think there's a tricky balance between academic freedom in its broadest sense and making sure that you are not in some way intimidating or imposing views on students. On the other hand, academic freedom allows for the most positive kind of dialogue and discussion properly handled. But I think that goes back to the role of the academic and balancing those two. Perhaps the most controversial one I'll suggest, some writers suggest that it should be temperate and civil and sort of measured commentary. In other words, you can't be rude. Now, hopefully that'll get lots of discussion. You know, does academic freedom have to be civil and proper, or can it be rude and uncivil? And I think that's an important debate, and like everything, they debate it on both sides.